March 22, 1945. West bank of the Rhine near Oppenheim. Propeller churn under moonlight. The river moved like something alive, thick with fog and diesel breath, its surface flickering under stray artillery flares. Along the west bank, engines coughed and muttered strange, hesitant sounds that did not belong to tanks or pontoon ferries. What the Germans on the opposite side saw next would unmoor centuries of confidence. Out of the mist came shapes that defied reason, wheeled trucks, their headlights covered their hulls, gliding through the current as if the river itself had bent to carry them. Each one was a DUKW, an ungainly six-wheeled amphibious truck built by American industry and scorned by every armchair general who had never seen it work. Tonight, it worked. The river that had guarded empires became a road. The churning of propellers echoed beneath the fog, a mechanical heartbeat against the slow pulse of water and war. Men crouched behind machine gun nests on the east bank, staring at those silhouettes sliding forward, unable to decide whether to fire or to pray. To the defenders, the Rhine was the Reich's spine, broad, cold, impassable. To the invaders, it was only a problem of buoyancy and horsepower. Each DUKW hauled 2.5 tons of gear, or 25 soldiers, across a current that ran 6 miles per hour. They advanced at nearly the same speed, neutralizing the river's bite through sheer mechanical rhythm. Within minutes, the first of them touched gravel under the far bank and disgorged men from the 5th Infantry Division. The crossing had begun before dawn, before the Germans even realized it was possible. From a trench near Bingen, a young lieutenant scribbled into his field book, "They came from the water. We thought the river itself had betrayed us." By sunrise, the illusion of safety along the Rhine was gone. 400 vehicles and 5,000 men had already crossed without a single completed bridge. The impossible had been mechanized, and as the last line of German sentries fell back through the haze, the river's new rhythm followed them, a steady thrum of propeller churn under moonlight, heralding the night. America taught the Reich that even water could be conquered by wheels. The question now was how deep that current would run once the bridges of the old world were gone. The Rhine had always been Germany's natural ally, a silver serpent that carved the continent in two, defending the heartland from whoever dared to come from the west. The generals of the Wehrmacht believed that the river would buy them time, perhaps weeks, perhaps months, enough to regroup, to hold the enemy at the waterline, as their grandfathers had done in 1918. Doctrine told them that a crossing without bridges was a fantasy, that no mechanized army could float its own logistics across one of Europe's fastest and broadest rivers. In their calculations, the Americans would be forced to stop, to build pontoons under fire to wait for bridging engineers. But the Americans had rewritten the rhythm of war, and they no longer waited for anything. In the minds of German staff officers, speed was a function of discipline, not machinery. Every bridge blown, every ferry destroyed, every pontoon cut loose from its mooring was a victory of control over chaos. They had studied Clausewitz's Napoleon, the Danube crossings, all the ways rivers had been used to slow the advance of an enemy's mass. But this new enemy moved differently. It didn't advance in columns, so much as in waves, mechanical, interchangeable, relentless. The DUKW was not elegant, nor was it fast on land, but it obeyed the one principle that had come to define American warfare: continuous motion. While the defenders trusted the permanence of the Rhine, the attackers trusted the adaptability of machines. The DUKW had been designed for Pacific Islands and shallow surf. Yet by 1945 it was serving on alpine rivers in freezing mud and along broken European roads. The Americans called it the Duck, and it lived up to the name. It swam, waddled, and carried the weight of an army wherever water or terrain threatened to stop it. Each carried 2.5 tons of supplies, or 25 fully armed men. The more they moved, the more the system accelerated. By contrast, the German engineers along the Rhine had only their textbooks and a dwindling stock of explosives. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division manned anti-tank ditches and machine gun nests, their rifles pointed across the fog. "The river defends itself," wrote Oberst Hans Frick in his report, "for no army can build under this current." It was the same assumption that had guided every defender from Caesar's day onward until that night in March when the Americans refused to build anything at all. For years, the Wehrmacht had prided itself on precision. The synchronization of fire, the calculated destruction of bridges at the last possible second, the discipline of holding a line even as the world collapsed around it. But precision was brittle. It depended on knowing what the enemy would do, and the Americans had grown increasingly unreadable. They did not telegraph intent. They didn't mass at the obvious crossings or wait for daylight. They simply arrived sometimes from the sky, sometimes from the sea, and now impossibly from the river itself. Patton's Third Army had learned from every mistake since Normandy. They had learned that success was not in the bridge but in the flow, how quickly one could shift fuel shells and men from one side to the other. At the Rhine, their logistics officers calculated not in yards of pontoon, but in gallons per minute. A DUKW could haul over 100 cans of gasoline in one trip. A convoy of 50 could move as much tonnage as a rail spur. They weren't crossing to attack, they were crossing to feed the next attack before it even began. The Germans never saw the numbers coming. To them, this was still a war of maneuvers of tank brigades and artillery duels. To the Americans, it had become a war of arithmetic. On the western bank, the 5th and 90th Infantry Divisions rehearsed load sequences under blackout conditions, each truck fitted with standardized tie-downs, propellers, pre-lubricated engines idling at 2 to 200 RPM to minimize noise signature. They practiced forming into columns spaced 30 yards apart to avoid collision wakes. Every motion was rehearsed to the second. Across the river, German artillery crews adjusted their elevation tables and waited for daylight, unaware that the enemy had already solved the problem of night. They believed the Americans were still laying pontoon sections miles upstream. When the first DUKW engines hummed against the current, most observers dismissed it as generator noise. Only when the fog broke did they understand, and by then the first wave was already on their shore. The arrogance of doctrine had become their trap. They had built an army on the idea that mastery of the physical world, bridges, trenches, obstacles, was mastery of war itself. But the Americans had turned that logic inside out. They had made the physical world serve their momentum. The Rhine, once an obstacle, became a conduit. A corporal of the 7th Parachute Regiment would later recall, "We fired at the water. The bullets made no difference. They kept coming swimming on wheels." By dawn, the myth of the impassable river had collapsed. The old German faith in fortifications, in order, in immovable defense, met the new American gospel of improvisation and speed. Where one side saw the Rhine as an ending, the other saw it as a beginning. And as the rising sun burned through the fog, the defenders began to grasp what was truly happening. The Americans had not just brought men, they had brought a system, a living network of steel and rubber and fuel, that moved with the rhythm of its own logic. Bridges no longer mattered. The next question for the defenders was not when the crossing would come. It already had. The real question was how much faster the enemy's machines could learn than men could understand. Before the Rhine could be conquered, there had been humiliation saltwater lessons written in mud and wreckage. The story of the DUKW did not begin with triumph, but with laughter. In Sicily in 1943, the first prototypes rolled from transport ships and immediately sank into Mediterranean surf. Men jeered from the decks as waves swallowed the ungainly machines. "They call them ducks," a sergeant had said, "because they drown like them." Engines seized, hull seams split, and propellers jammed with kelp. Out of the first dozen test landings, nearly half were lost. But in that failure, American engineers learned a brutal truth. There was no such thing as a perfect machine, only one that could learn faster than it broke. At Naples, crews tore apart damaged units to understand what had gone wrong. They discovered the ocean's cruelty in equations, pressure seals too thin by half an inch, bilge pumps underpowered for surf velocity, center of gravity skewed toward the front axle. Every failure became a calculation. Every drowned vehicle, a chapter in a new gospel of adaptation. By late 1943, they were sealing hull seams with rubber gaskets that could hold against 5 feet of water pressure and installing twin bilge systems capable of clearing 200 gallons per minute. The DUKW that would one day climb the Rhine had been reborn through salt and corrosion. Training followed failure like a shadow. In British harbors at Devonport and along the muddy banks of the Medway, recruits practiced night crossings under blackout, no compass lights, no chatter. They learned to feel the current through the steering column, to listen for the subtle pitch shift that meant the propeller was striking debris. Instructors shouted over the engine roar, "Don't fight the current, use it." That phrase became doctrine. Men learned to throttle back, let the river pull, then pivot with a half-turn of the wheel. Those who fought the water capsized. Those who learned its rhythm survived. By the time the units reached France in 1944, each DUKW crew was part mechanic, part navigator, part gambler. They carried grease guns and maps, torque wrenches and compasses, and they could disassemble half their drivetrain in the field if it meant another hour of mobility. Don't curse the leak, find the rhythm, one manual advised. They grew superstitious about the machines, painting them with names. Water Mule, Flood, Baby Missouri Dream. Their hulls rattled, their engines coughed, but they moved. The first true test came not in battle, but in disaster. When winter storms flooded the Scheldt estuary, entire supply lines were trapped. Conventional trucks sank axle-deep in sludge. DUKWs waded in ferrying rations and fuel over water that would have stopped any army on Earth. Crews operated for 36 hours straight, running on cold coffee and adrenaline. Commanders began to notice whenever the ducks arrived, things kept moving. It was never glamour work. They were not heroes of the front. They were ghosts of the rear-keeping divisions, fed and armed while others got the medals. But those same ghosts became the backbone of an empire of motion. For every tank shell fired on the front, a DUKW somewhere had carried the powder to make it. For every bridge blown, a DUKW found another path. Still, the Rhine loomed larger than any tide they had faced. Freshwater currents were swifter, the banks steeper, the nights colder. The river's flow near Oppenheim reached 6 miles per hour, enough to twist a hull offline in seconds. Engineers recalibrated propellers for torque rather than speed-cutting efficiency on calm water to gain control in turbulence. They reinforced prop shafts with steel sleeves scavenged from decommissioned Jeeps improvised at field depots because no replacement parts could be shipped fast enough. Each modification was done under fire, guided by instinct and survival. One test log from Devonport recorded a night exercise under gale force wind. DUKW-14 capsized at EUR 142, recovered under its own power at EUR 154. That single note told a story larger than itself, 12 minutes between drowning and resurrection. Those minutes were the tuition of innovation. The Germans, by contrast, had stopped learning. Their amphibious experiments, pontoon ferries, light assault boats, had been abandoned after Stalingrad. The Reich's engineers had no time to experiment, no margin for error. By 1945, they fought with what they knew, while the Americans fought with what they were still discovering. When the crossing at the Rhine came, the DUKW crews carried ghosts of every failure before them. They remembered Sicily's surf, Salerno's tides, the screaming wind at Antwerp. They knew how to read the water by its smell, its temperature, the way foam gathered at the bends. They had turned improvisation into reflex. Under the fog of March 22nd, when the first engines coughed to life, it was not courage that filled the men, but memory. They had drowned enough times to know the cost of hesitation. One driver, Sergeant Luke Rains, later wrote, "We had no map for that river. Just our hands on the wheel and the sound of the prop under us. And so when the Rhine opened before them, they did not hesitate. They throttled forward into the mist, guided not by orders, but by the hard-earned instinct of failure transformed into motion. Each spinning propeller carried with it the ghosts of every sunken prototype, every cursed mechanic, every sleepless test run that had taught them how to survive. What the Germans mistook for miracle was simply the sum of all those mistakes paid for in sweat, salt, and time. The river would not forgive errors, but for once the Americans had none left to make. The night over the Rhine was heavy with mist and rumor. Artillery flashes painted the clouds, red, then white, then black again. Somewhere behind the lines, loudspeakers blared diversionary orders and illusion to distract the Germans from the true crossing site. The defenders waited near Wesel and Remagen, but the real thunder was building at Oppenheim, where the 5th Infantry Division and the 204th Engineer Combat Battalion were already knee-deep in mud, readying the fleet. The DUKWs lined in rows like patient beasts shuddered as engines turned over, muffled under tarpaulins. Their propellers stirred the shallows with a steady hiss, the propeller churn under moonlight, now a rhythm of intent. At 0200 hours, General Irwin gave the signal. The first wave of DUKWs rolled forward, headlights, darkened wheels biting at the bank, until water swallowed them whole. The fog wrapped each machine in a veil of silver. From the east bank, German sentries heard the rumble but saw nothing. It sounded like wind through distant turbines. Then beneath that, the low growl of diesel rising a pulse that made the ground tremble. Generators 1 whispered. They're powering up their bridges. But there were no bridges. Only the river itself bending under the weight of a new kind of assault. The DUKWs advanced in staggered lines, 20-yard spacing propellers cutting against the 6-mile-per-hour current. Each carried 25 men and half a ton of ammunition. Their speed was slow but inexorable, 6 miles per hour against the tide, equal to a walking soldier, but multiplied across the current like a marching column of ghosts. When the first wave neared midstream, German mortars opened fire. Shells fell short, bursting in water plumes that rocked the trucks but failed to sink them. The steel hulls flexed, taking the shock, and the convoy kept moving. Then machine guns joined the chorus tracer fire, slicing across fog so thick it lit nothing but vapor. The Germans couldn't see what they were shooting at. They were firing at sound. On the western bank, more ducks entered the water. Mechanics shouted over engines, checking bilge pumps, timing prop revolutions, 2 to 400 RPM steady, not a fraction higher. Soldiers clutched rifles to their chests, knuckles white with fear. Yet none turned back. The Rhine, that ancient frontier, no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a current to be mastered. By 02:30, the first DUKWs nosed onto the far shore hulls, scraping gravel. Ramp gates dropped and infantry poured out their boots, splashing into enemy soil. Within minutes, the riverbank erupted with movement, men fanning out, establishing perimeters, radio operators tuning frequencies. Crossing secure came the first message across field channels. The impossible had just been reduced to a report code. German searchlights snapped on, sweeping wildly through the fog. Their beams caught brief flashes, steel hulls, glinting water streaming off tires. But by the time gunners adjusted, the targets had already vanished into reeds. An artillery observer near Bingen recorded in his log, "We heard them before we saw them." The sound of the river changed. By dawn, the crossing had achieved what textbooks said was impossible, a combat transfer of thousands across a 400-yard current without a single fixed bridge. 400 DUKWs ferried men, jeeps, and even light artillery across in rotation 3-round trips per hour. One engineer timed it 20 minutes to load, 15 to cross, 10 to unload. Efficiency measured in minutes, not miracles. Patton's forces, originally ordered to wait for bridging units, ignored protocol. When informed that his men were already on the east bank, he is said to have laughed. "If ducks can swim, so can the Third Army." By 0700, German artillery began shelling the west bank furiously, hoping to cut supply lines, but the Americans had already reversed the flow. The same amphibious trucks that had carried assault troops now ferried back the wounded and hauled forward crates of fuel. The Rhine, once a moat, had become a two-way street. The defenders were stunned. Their doctrine had no page for this. "We thought they would bridge," one captured corporal later said, "but they never built anything. They just came." The sense of disbelief was total. Pontoon crews waited for targets that never materialized. Artillery observers kept searching for bridgeheads. Command posts radioed reports of phantom crossings. By the time they realized what had happened, American infantry were already 6 miles inland. The fog lifted at mid-morning. What it revealed was a spectacle no army had prepared for: rivers choked with moving trucks, wheels turning under the waterline, engines roaring like a mechanized tide. Behind them came barges, landing craft, pontoons, all riding in the wake of the DUKWs that had proved the way. For the first time since the invasion of Normandy, the Wehrmacht faced an enemy it could neither predict nor contain. The DUKW crossing broke more than a defensive line. It shattered the psychological hold of geography itself. The Rhine was no longer Germany's spine. It was a wound. By noon, traffic control officers were standing on the east bank, waving batons to direct the flow, jeeps, half-tracks, artillery all disembarking in ordered chaos. Fuel drums clattered on wooden decks, ammunition boxes passed hand to hand. Overhead, fighter bombers strafed the retreating German convoys on the opposite road, sealing the encirclement. Losses were minimal. Out of hundreds of DUKWs launched that night, fewer than 10 failed to make the crossing, most to engine stalls, none to direct enemy fire. Each failure was quickly replaced. Spare hulls rolled down from staging areas within hours. The American tempo never faltered. By evening, Oppenheim was firmly in Allied hands. Patton himself crossed in a staff car aboard one of the Ducks, grinning beneath his helmet as he saluted the engineers who had turned water into highway. "The river doesn't stop men," he said to a reporter. "Only ideas do." On the eastern horizon, the retreating Germans could still hear it, the faint rhythmic churn of propellers echoing across the twilight water. For them, it sounded like defeat taking form. For the men who rode the Ducks, it sounded like progress endless and unstoppable. And as night fell again, the Rhine flowed the same as it always had, but its meaning had changed forever. The line that once divided Europe now carried the engines of its own undoing. By the second dawn, the Rhine no longer belonged to the Germans. Its gray surface, once a symbol of invulnerability, had become a living highway. The air above it smelled of diesel and cordite, a blend of war and industry. DUKWs moved in constant rotation, round trip after round trip, ferrying ammunition, fuel, food, and men as if the river itself had been conscripted. The same trucks that had carried assault troops hours earlier now hauled crates of 105mm shells stacked 4 deep. Each amphibious run averaged 2.8 trips per hour, their engines humming at 200 RPM like a heartbeat that refused to fade. The crossing at Oppenheim was only the first act. Once commanders saw how cleanly the DUKWs had shattered the need for bridges, they ordered more crossings: Remagen, Wesel, Koblenz. It became a rhythm. Engineers simply looked at a map, found a wide section of water, and marked it temporary road. The Ducks would handle the rest. In less than a week, 60,000 men and 10,000 vehicles had crossed. Rhine throughput, once a logistical impossibility, tripled to 2,700 tons per day. German artillery could shell the banks, but not the river. Their shells detonated uselessly in spray. The Ducks were not targets, they were motion. Crews began modifying their machines in the field. Mechanics replaced gear ratios to give more torque against strong currents. Bilge pumps were swapped for higher capacity models scavenged from Navy craft. A few crews welded spare armor plates to the hulls, not because they expected to be hit, but because they wanted the extra weight to stabilize the ride. Innovation had become reflex. "Don't wait for orders, fix it yourself," read a chalk sign above the engineer depot. By then, the Germans understood the threat too late. A captured officer confessed, "We had guns, but no doctrine for rivers that moved." Anti-tank squads tried firing Panzerfausts from the shoreline, but the fog and moving water ruined their aim. When a shell did strike, the DUKWs often kept floating, metal flexing water, hissing through seams, pumps roaring to keep balance. Crews joked that their machines bled like soldiers and lived like ships. At Wesel, British and Canadian units adopted the same amphibious method. Their DUKWs ferried supplies for Montgomery's 21st Army Group, running alongside American convoys in what one correspondent called a floating factory line. Coordination between Allied forces became seamless. The Americans supplied spare parts. The British contributed navigation crews trained in coastal tides. Together, they created an amphibious logistics network stretching from Nijmegen to Cologne. The Rhine had never seen such organized chaos. One photograph from March 25th captures the scale: a procession of ducks, nose to tail, across the current sunlight, flashing on wet hulls, each stacked with wooden crates. The caption reads, "The army that floats." By then, the novelty had worn off. What had begun as a desperate improvisation had become routine. Crews joked about schedules, about missing the morning convoy, as if it were a bus route. Behind the humor was exhaustion. The crossings never stopped. Daylight brought artillery. Night brought fog and exhaustion. Mechanics worked in waist-deep water, patching hulls with tar and canvas, hands numb from the cold. Yet they kept the rhythm alive. When one DUKW sank midstream, 2 others lashed lines and dragged it back like rescuers pulling a wounded comrade. It was less an army now than an organism, a breathing system of fuel, steel, and human will. Patton's Third Army advanced eastward, outrunning its maps. Supply officers marked new rivers, the Main, the Werra, the Weser, as future crossings. Each would see the same ritual reconnaissance, a few hours of preparation, Then the churn of propellers and the slow rise of trucks gliding from one world to the next. Geography no longer meant delay. The ducks had dissolved it. And with each successful crossing, the German defensive network unraveled faster. Troops who once relied on natural obstacles found themselves encircled before they could retreat. They crossed everywhere, a German private later said, as if water had turned against us. Panic spread through the ranks, not because of the size of the enemy's force, but because of its fluidity. The Americans seemed to appear from the river, from mist, from directions that maps didn't predict. By early April, the DUKWs were no longer just tactical vehicles, they were strategic instruments. Commanders used them to move entire field hospitals across rivers. In one night near Mainz, 320 wounded were ferried to the western bank, while the same convoy carried back ammunition on the return run. It was the perfect symmetry of war logistics. Nothing moved empty, everything served two purposes. The versatility of the duck extended beyond combat. Local civilians watched from shattered villages as convoys of amphibious trucks rolled through their flooded streets, carrying bread, medical kits, even children. What had begun as a weapon of invasion had become a bridge of survival. For many Germans, the first Allied soldiers they met arrived not in tanks, but in floating trucks handing out rations. By mid-April, as Allied armies raced toward the Elbe, the DUKW symbolized a deeper victory, the triumph of improvisation over rigidity of movement, over fortification. The Rhine had been more than a battlefield. It had been a laboratory. Out of that experiment emerged a new law of warfare: the side that keeps moving wins. One German engineer interviewed after the surrender summed it up with reluctant respect. Our bridges were precise, our defenses perfect, but they made the river disappear. As the sun set over a conquered Rhine, the sound of engines still lingered, echoing off water and steel. The river no longer divided nations, it carried them. And beneath the glow of the fading day, hundreds of DUKWs continued their endless commute, their propellers carving ripples into history, a reminder that in 1945, victory did not march across the river. It floated. In the heart of the war machine that fed Patton's Third Army, the miracle of the Rhine crossing had to be repeated every day, not on the riverbanks, but in factories, depots, and classrooms thousands of miles away. The Amphibious DUKW did not just fight. It was manufactured momentum, the physical embodiment of a system that turned blueprints into motion at a pace no army in history had matched. In the winter of 1945, the American home front was less a place than a rhythm, a 24-hour heartbeat of steel fuel and sweat driving the war forward. In Pontiac, Michigan, the General Motors truck and coach division roared without pause. The air smelled of oil and ozone. Sparks showered from welders' torches like steel rain. 4 lines, 40 stations each built the ducks in a choreography of speed and precision. From raw frame to complete vehicle took less than 72 hours. 80% of the DUKW's components were interchangeable with standard GMC trucks, meaning no special tooling was required. Fenders and axles for civilian transport were being fitted to amphibious hulls, 1 hour to ordinary cargo haulers the next. This modular genius made production unstoppable. At its peak, the Pontiac plant turned out 38 units a day. Another 20 came from Chicago, 30 more from Yellow Truck's Cleveland line. Subcontractors in Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania supplied parts in synchronized convoys, gearboxes, steering columns, propeller shafts, bilge pump housings, all tagged with paper slips noting the exact minute of dispatch. Train yards loaded with DUKWs rolled east under blackout tarps crossing the Appalachians at night. By the time the Rhine campaign began, replacements were already en route thousands of miles behind the front, yet precisely on schedule. But machinery was nothing without men. In depots from Cherbourg to Antwerp, maintenance crews learned to treat every DUKW as a patient, not a vehicle. Field workshops set up under canvas tents could strip and rebuild an engine in 12 hours. Mechanics worked by lantern light, their hands black with grease, the air filled with the buzz of portable welders. They kept tally on chalkboards: 1 DUKW lost 2, repaired 1, rebuilt. The arithmetic of survival tilted in their favor. For every 10 destroyed, 15 more arrived. Lose 10, return 20, they joked, half proudly, half in disbelief. It wasn't arrogance, it was arithmetic backed by assembly lines. Fuel was the blood of the system. Tankers at Le Havre pumped gasoline into steel drums labeled in stenciled code F17A, F19B, each batch traced to its chemical mix. From there, trains moved them to inland depots where DUKWs themselves would ferry the barrels upriver to combat zones. Each truck carried a dual-load outward ammunition and food, returned the wounded and empty drums. Nothing moved in one direction. Efficiency had become doctrine. Behind the Rhine operations, logistics officers studied their graphs like tacticians studied maps. Throughput in tons per day, mechanical readiness percentages, mean time between failures. They spoke in the language of factories, not fortresses. The DUKW's average service life in combat zones was 620 operating hours, twice what had been predicted. A single field company could maintain 75 of them in rotation, ensuring that at least 60 were always operational. Attrition was absorbed by rhythm. The system replaced itself faster than it could be destroyed. Training mirrored production. In the British port of Falmouth, new crews practiced amphibious entries on slate-gray water, driving off piers into surf and reversing out again until the motion became instinct. Each man logged 200 hours before joining a combat unit. They were trained not only to drive but to diagnose a mechanic navigator and pilot in one. If it breaks, you fix it. If it sinks, you swim it, the instructors said. That philosophy turned factory workers into field engineers, soldiers into technicians. The learning never stopped. By the time of the Rhine training, manuals had evolved from thin pamphlets to thick volumes annotated with handwritten notes. Bilge valve leaks under cold throttle, lag in cross-current steer, by current, not by compass. Each field innovation was sent back to Detroit, revised overnight, and printed into new doctrine. Knowledge traveled as fast as steel. Meanwhile, in warehouses scattered across France, spare parts moved through what the Army called pipeline operations. Each shipment had a 72-hour window, from arrival to frontline delivery. If a part missed that window, it was rerouted to another unit. The network was self-correcting, a living supply organism that could sense its own weaknesses and rewire itself. To the Germans, whose transport lines relied on handwritten requisitions and dwindling rail cars, such adaptability was unthinkable. Even at the front, the industrial pulse could be felt. The roar of engines on the Rhine was not just American. It was the echo of factories thousands of miles away working in harmony. Each propeller's churn connected to the clatter of assembly lines. Each splash on the river corresponded to a stamping press in Michigan or a riveter in Illinois. The front and the factory had become one continuous circuit. German prisoners marveled at the abundance. "You have factories at the front," one said, staring at a repair depot operating beside the river. He wasn't wrong. By 1945, American logistics had erased the separation between production and battle. The river crossings were not isolated events, but industrial continuations of the same process that had begun at the blueprint table. And through it all, the rhythm held fuel, steel, men, water, each feeding the other. When a DUKW failed midstream, it was hauled back, stripped, repaired, relaunched within a day. The concept of loss had become elastic. Nothing stayed broken long enough to matter. The enemy still fought with bravery and precision, but bravery could not multiply itself. Factories could. In the spring air over the Rhine, the difference between the two systems was visible. On one side, the remnants of a collapsing industry, rail yards, bombed factories, hollowed. On the other, an assembly line that stretched across oceans delivering motion faster than destruction could catch it. It was the first time in history that a battle had been fought by an economy as much as by an army. By early April, the ducks were no longer a novelty. They were a fixture of the landscape as natural as the rivers they crossed. At depots near Mainz, crews slept in the backs of their vehicles, engines idling to keep warm. When they woke, they simply drove back into the water. Production training and combat had merged into one seamless act. In the end, victory on the Rhine was not just a triumph of courage or strategy. It was the triumph of organization. Every rivet, every shipment, every hour of factory labor had converged into that steady hum beneath the fog. The propeller churn that once sounded alien to the German sentries now symbolized something far larger, the sound of a nation's machinery learning to think, move, and fight as one. And as the last waves of ducks glided eastward, the engineers who built them already knew this was not the end of invention. It was proof of a new order where wars would be won not only by men in the field, but by the factories that taught steel how to swim. When the war ended, the Rhine fell silent again. The fog that once hid the DUKWs now rose over a river returned to peace. Along the banks, twisted hulls and rusting propellers jutted from the mud. Mute witnesses to the nights when the water itself had been conquered. German villagers rebuilding their shattered towns found them half buried in silt. Some dragged the hulks ashore to use as storage sheds or fishing docks. Others left them where they were as though the river had claimed them. In time, the sound of propeller churn under moonlight became only a memory, but it lingered in the men who had heard it. For the soldiers who crossed in those trucks, the DUKW was more than a machine. It was proof that ingenuity could defeat geography. They remembered the way it felt beneath their boots, metal flexing on water engines, vibrating through the soles of their feet, as if the earth itself had decided to move with them. In letters home, some wrote that it felt like driving on a dream. For others, it was the sound of home, the factory-made hum that connected them back to Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, to the unseen millions who had built the war behind the war. The Rhine crossings became case studies in the years that followed. Military academies in America, Britain, and even Germany rewrote their manuals. Rivers were no longer obstacles, but logistics corridors. Mobility is imagination applied to terrain. Read the first line of the new field manual 5-5, published in 1946. The lesson of the DUKW wasn't just engineering, it was the realization that speed and adaptability could outweigh fortresses and walls. Where the old armies had measured victory in miles gained, the new ones would measure it in hours saved. Civilian engineers adopted the same thinking. The DUKW's design seeded the next generation of amphibious craft, the Lark, the Super Duck, the modern AAV. In floods from the Mississippi to the Mekong, they appeared again, painted orange, now ferrying food instead of ammunition, rescuing families instead of soldiers. The same rivets that had carried men through gunfire now carried children through stormwater. The line between war and relief blurred, but the mechanism of salvation was the same. For Germany, the sight of those vehicles had become a quiet symbol of transition. The river that once marked the frontier of the Reich became a bridge to reconstruction. Allied engineers used surviving DUKWs to move supplies for rebuilding roads, power stations, and bridges. Within a year, the same amphibious trucks that had broken the Wehrmacht's defenses were hauling concrete for its recovery. Out of defeat came utility proof that motion itself had no allegiance. In America, the legend of the duck lived on in veterans' reunions and parades. Children climbed aboard restored hulls at state fairs, unaware that their smooth olive surfaces had once carried war across the heart of Europe. In cities like Boston and Seattle, old DUKWs found new lives as tourist craft, bobbing through harbors filled with laughter instead of fear. Tour guides spoke of history lightly, but beneath every ripple, the ghosts of the Rhine still stirred. For the men who built them and the men who rode them, the lesson endured: organized quality and scale would always triumph over isolated brilliance. The DUKW had not been a miracle. It had been a system, a fusion of discipline and imagination that proved victory could be engineered as surely as it could be fought for. Years later, as the last surviving veterans watched documentaries replay the crossing in grainy black and white, they could still hear it, the hum, the churn, the rhythm that once turned a river into a road. And on quiet nights along the Rhine, when fog drifts low and the current murmurs against the stones, some locals still claim they can hear it too, that faint, steady pulse beneath the water. The echo of propeller churn under moonlight, reminding the world how a machine once taught even a river to move.